So much for attending. I'm delighted and honored to be here with you. Buenos días a todos y muchas gracias por asistir. Estoy encantada y me siento honorada de estar aquí con ustedes. I ask your patience also because that is about the limit of my Spanish. Before we start this presentation, I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. So here in Canada, land acknowledgements are part of a larger process that we're undertaking as individuals and as organizations towards reconciliation between non-Indigenous and Indigenous peoples in Canada. They're based on an old tradition or protocol carried out by Indigenous communities, which are intended as a way for guests to show their respect for and pay homage to the Indigenous community. With this in mind, I'd like to acknowledge that the land on which I live and work, known to me as Montreal, is land which has long served as site of meeting and exchange among several Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. I honor and respect the diverse Indigenous people connected to this territory. Thank you. So before we get started, I thought I would give a little bit of background about who I am and what inspired this research. So to let you know this, here I'm going to give you a quick biography, which is I have been a teacher most of my life. I grew up in Ontario and I started babysitting and working with small children at the age of 13 in summer camps. I was a swimming instructor and an English tutor in secondary school, and I've always believed I was going to be a teacher. So it felt natural for me once I graduated from high school to enroll in the Bachelor of Education program at McGill. When I graduated from this program in 1998, and this is a picture of me when I graduated, I found a job immediately as an ESL teacher in a French language school, so an English second language, teaching English to French kids. It was a complete shock to my system. And this is because although I'd always believed I was born to be a teacher, the realities of teaching were so much harder than I'd anticipated. I struggled constantly to establish control in the classroom. I wanted to connect with the students, but instead I found myself laying down the law on a daily basis. I wanted to create meaningful lessons that inspired critical thinking and creativity, but I found myself handing out grammar drills and letting my students watch television shows in class because I just needed to keep them busy when lesson planning became overwhelming. I cried nearly every night. I made so many mistakes, but slowly, very slowly, I got better at teaching and more confident. And looking back, it took me about 5 years of trial and error classroom experience and work and training outside the classroom before I began to feel like a real teacher. In 2012, after completing my master's, I began teaching future teachers at McGill University and the Université de Quebec à Montréal. When I was a high school teacher, I had welcomed many student teachers who were doing their practicum into my classroom. So when I started this job, I was really looking forward to sharing my enthusiasm and experience with them as their university instructor. But to my surprise, despite an overhaul of the curriculum of teacher education programs that occurred in the early 2000s, my students complained to me that they felt overwhelmed on the practicum and underprepared by the courses they took in their university programs. In other words, they were going through the same struggles I had experienced nearly 2 decades earlier. At the same time, the media were starting to report alarming numbers of teachers leaving the profession. So why, I thought, can't we in teacher education help student teachers feel better prepared? What are we missing? And that's how I began my doctorate. I started doing research and realized there's actually a shortage of teachers worldwide. And that's the bad news. The worst news is that it's not just that fewer teachers are entering the profession, it's that many are leaving it too early, and this is known as attrition. The problem is particularly acute for second language teachers, so English second language and French second language teachers in Canada. In fact, in the French and Collins study, which was published in 2011, nearly half of all Quebec ESL teachers reported considering leaving their profession in the past year. So there's evidently a problem with retaining second language teachers. My next step was to find out what the problem was. So this was the question that began my research. What is it about the situation for second language teachers in Quebec that makes them more likely to drop out than other teachers in other contexts? What I found in my literature review was that teacher motivations for leaving early can broadly be divided into two categories. The first are extrinsic or contextual factors, and these include things like workload, conflict, and classroom management issues. The second are intrinsic factors, and these are things such as a lack of collegiality, few opportunities for collaboration, an unsupportive administration, as well as psychological factors. And this is when I came across the theory of teacher self-efficacy as a possible way of understanding who stays and who leaves. So what is teacher self-efficacy? Well, it's based on efficacy theory, which is a construct first proposed by psychologist Albert Bandura in 1977. And efficacy is a construct that describes a person's belief in their ability to do something well. And teacher self-efficacy, as defined by Woolfolk, Rousseff, and Hoy, is the teacher's belief that they can have a positive effect on student learning. Now, the idea of self-efficacy is interesting to researchers looking to understand attrition, and here's why. Because greater efficacy leads to greater effort and persistence. So we can think about it as a kind of spiral. The higher the sense of efficacy a teacher experiences, in other words, the more they believe in their teaching abilities, the higher the goals they'll set for themselves, and the less likely they are to feel failure. And the reverse is true. The lower the sense of efficacy a teacher has, in other words, the less they believe they can make a difference, the more likely they are to avoid challenges, and the more likely they are to give up when difficulties emerge. So my questions now were, how do we get future teachers started on the right track to high efficacy? When is teacher self-efficacy developed? Can we start in teacher education? Well, the short answer to the last question is yes, we can start in teacher education. And this is because, according to efficacy theory, efficacy beliefs are most pliable early in learning. So if we want to help future teachers become resilient by helping them build strong feelings of efficacy, we should do it in teacher education before they entered the field. And this led me to my next questions, which are, what is currently happening in teacher education that helps teachers build efficacy? What are we doing well? What can we do better? My research goal became to look at how future ESL teachers build a sense of efficacy during teacher education and the practicum experience in particular. To be clear, what I'm presenting to you today was part of my larger doctoral study, which include mixed methods. The findings I'm presenting to you today look at the qualitative phase of mixed method research. In this phase, I recruited participants who were enrolled in their third year of a teaching English second language or TESOL degree at 2 different universities in Montreal. In both programs, the practicum begins in the fall and finishes in December. My research took place in the fall session of 2019, before, during, and after the practical experience. Participants were making sense of their own experiences while in practicum. So I decided to gather narrative data. In other words, what stories were the student teachers telling themselves about their experiences? In order to collect these stories, I designed a variation on the focus group format and created a setting where small groups of participants were asked questions designed to provoke narratives. I called these story circles. Now, the story circles method proved to be really efficient. I managed to collect over 200 anecdotes from my participants in about 6 hours. The data collected was also very rich as participants built upon each other's shared experiences. Data was recorded and transcribed into Word documents before being transferred to Excel spreadsheets and analyzed both thematically as well as narratively. So today in this talk, I'm going to present 3 key findings from my research. I'll outline them now and then dig into them one by one so we can see what they mean for teacher education. The first finding dealt with how future ESL teachers build efficacy through a specific process. The second one looked at the kinds of spaces or conditions teachers need to learn and build efficacy. And the final one was that there is a serious problem with the way that we evaluate future teachers. Okay, let's look at each one in turn. The first finding was that changes in efficacy were the result of a specific process. So first, the student teacher really needed to watch a host or mentor teacher model teaching strategies effectively. And this is what Bandura calls vicarious sources of mastery. So you get to watch someone teach and you believe that you can do what they're doing. Next, the student teacher needs to try out these strategies. I want to stop here a second and have you take a mental note of this step, because not only is it an essential part of the process, but it also needs specific conditions in order to happen successfully. I'll talk about what those conditions are in finding number 2. All right, moving on. Once they've reflected on these experiences, deciding what works and what doesn't, they can consolidate their learning and start to use their strategies they found most effective in their teaching more consistently. And using the most effective teaching strategies leads to mastery experiences, or experiences of success, which is the strongest source of efficacy building. Cumulative mastery experiences can then in turn lead to overall increases in teacher self-efficacy. So it's part of a process. So that's great. We have the process down. Now we need to address the key condition for learning to take place. In step 2, when teachers are learning to teach, not only do they need to try new strategies, they need to be able to take risks with these strategies without fearing failure. In other words, they need to be able to feel free to make mistakes while they're learning. Without making mistakes, they can't reflect. They can't figure out what works and what doesn't, and why some strategies work and others don't. So the second finding was that future teachers need access to classroom spaces to try teaching strategies, but this space must allow for risk-taking. The problem is, this is happening to varying degrees in the practicum experience. Thematic and narrative analysis from my research indicate that although the student teacher needs to take over teaching from their host teacher, the degree to which access to the classroom space is granted depends largely on the willingness of the host teacher to relinquish control of the classroom. In effect, the teacher mentor acts as a gatekeeper, controlling access to the classroom space, which means the student teacher must often negotiate with their host teacher over when and how they'll take over teaching. And the host teacher holds all the cards. They are the judge of whether or not the student teacher is ready to start teaching, and they grant access to the classroom. And this is why so many student teachers feel they must conform to what their host teacher's ideas are of what a good teacher looks like. And it's also why they often fear taking risks and making mistakes in the classroom. And here are some quotes from the study that exemplify this experience. The first one illustrates some of the limited access I described earlier, and the second one helps us see how the process of trial, error, and reflection can really help the future teacher develop practice when they have the chance. So the third and most striking finding from my research was that the way we evaluate students during the practicum actually prevents them from doing a number of key things. The first thing it does is decrease risk-taking. And this is exactly the opposite of what we want for our student teachers. In effect, the student teachers were afraid to make mistakes when they're being observed by their host teacher or supervisor, because they feel if they take a risk and fail, they'll be punished with bad grades. In other words, feeling like they were constantly under evaluation made risk-taking and experimentation even more difficult. And as we've seen, risk-taking is an essential condition for that reflection and learning. These quotes from my participants illustrate the point beautifully. They describe the risks involved in trial and error, which are specifically linked to observation and criticism. Feeling constantly watched, judged, and evaluated creates a fear of failure. So it inhibits opportunity for the kinds of risk-taking that I talked about earlier. This is the process of trial, error, and reflection that's needed to have mastery experiences, which in turn build the overall efficacy. But it gets worse. Not only does being evaluated decrease the likelihood that the student teachers will take risks, make mistakes, and learn from their mistakes, it also creates feelings of resentment when they get feedback about their teaching. Now, as someone who has given a lot of feedback to student teachers over the years, this was a real wake-up call when I realized that student teachers often see the well-intentioned feedback they get from their host teachers as criticism rather than as an opportunity for growth and reflection. Here's an example of the kind of quote that I got from my participants and their feelings about the feedback they were getting. So research into evaluation in other fields supports this finding. For example, Bauer et al. Found that when there's a power imbalance amongst the stakeholders, as there is here with the student teacher, the host teacher, or the university supervisor, it's a lot harder to engage in participatory evaluation processes. In fact, power can hinder equal and genuine communication about the value of practices evaluated. The feedback that creates genuine growth and reflection in my findings actually came from the classroom students. Their reaction and the way they react to a lesson told the student teacher how successful they were. In order to better understand how hierarchies of power can influence the student teacher's acceptance of feedback in the practicum, I proposed this construct. So there's a clear pattern in my research that shows the greater the power the person giving feedback had over the student teacher, the less likely they were to accept the suggestions, and the more likely they were to resent it. At the top of the pyramid, the university supervisor is placed in a position of ultimate power. They're the gatekeepers to certification. So the pre-service teacher or the student teacher must always be aware of pleasing the observer evaluator, or risk failing the practicum experience and possibly losing the chance to be certified. Immediately below the supervisor is the cooperating teacher or the teacher mentor, who controls access to the classroom spaces and whose evaluations form the basis of the university supervisor's grades. The supervisor in my construct is above the cooperating teacher only because they have the power to override the cooperating teacher's evaluation and to intervene in the case of conflict between the host cooperating teacher and the student teacher. Conflict that happens, unfortunately, all too often. Next are the student teacher's peers, who have some power of social persuasion, but whose feedback is much more easily accepted by the pre-service teacher. And that's why there's this nice thick line here, because above the line it's hard for them to accept the feedback, and below the line it's much easier. So the peers are followed by the classroom students, who have the least amount of power and whose feedback is seen as the most genuine in the eyes of the student teachers. The final problem with the hierarchical evaluation structure is that it prevents the student teachers from constructing their teacher identity effectively. And this is because it encourages a climate where the future teachers perform to please rather than perform their identity in authentic ways. And here's an example of a situation where a student teacher really felt that his lesson plan worked very well in the way that he wanted to do it and had experience doing it, but he had to give an inauthentic performance because his supervisor wanted to see something different. And the lesson actually failed as a result. So perhaps unsurprisingly, the opposite of observation and evaluation, in other words, the opportunity to be given the space to teach alone and unobserved, was a key condition for successful efficacy and identity building in my study. In other words, when student teachers could teach in a space without evaluation, where they felt free to make mistakes without judgment, they were able to build both efficacy and identities successfully. Most of the time, this was done through substitute teaching contracts, also known as subbing, but it also occurred whenever the cooperating teacher was out of the room and the student teacher could teach on their own. And here are a couple of quotes that illustrate this experience. The final quote was the most telling because it talks to the feelings that being evaluated demotivates student teachers, and teaching on their own really gives them a chance to bolster their confidence and enthusiasm for the profession, which eventually will lead to more resilience. So far, I've presented findings that indicate that in order to build efficacy, student teachers need to be able to take risks in the classroom, and the space to take risks most often happens when they're alone and not feeling evaluated or judged. Another key condition that really supports efficacy building is the chance to build on the support of their peers. Here's some quotes that exemplify this. One other interesting thing I noticed about peer feedback, as I read through the transcripts of the story circle, I noticed an unexpected result of the research project itself. That is, the opportunity to share experiences with peers was really helpful. As one participant told stories of success, others chimed in with their own stories, both of challenges and successes, and negotiated the whole experience. And these stories seemed to increase the whole group sense of efficacy in the fashion of a bricklayer. So each story built upon the next, cementing together group feelings of efficacy through shared experiences of success. The peer interaction in this kind of nascent professional learning community provided a space for the students to sort of co-construct efficacy in future imagined moments of success. So those are the findings. Let's take a moment now to look at how teacher education can use some of the information from this research to create conditions where future teachers can build efficacy, identity, and resilience. The first takeaway is that the way we currently evaluate future second language teachers during their practicum is problematic for a number of reasons. And chief among these are the power dynamics evaluation creates between the teacher, the host teacher or teacher evaluator, and the student teacher. And here's where I think the pandemic has opened the door for us to rethink how we can evaluate future teachers. For example, in the programs where I teach in Montreal, in order to follow public health regulations during the pandemic, the supervisor is now physically out of the classroom. Instead, we asked student teachers to film themselves teaching. After school, we watched the film of the student teaching together. As we watched, we asked the students to self-evaluate using our guidance. Asking students to reflect on their own development through watching themselves teach can really redress the power hierarchies inherent in the more traditional evaluation, and it encourages the kind of accountability and reflective practice that can sustain growth in teachers, even after they've left teacher education. So addressing the power dynamics in the evaluation process would open the door for the kinds of constructive dialogue and feedback future teachers really need. Another suggestion could be to have the university supervisors and mentors start thinking of themselves as coaches rather than evaluators. And this shift in thinking about our role as supervisors could help us in our own reflections of how we support our future teachers through their learning process. For example, how can we ask questions that encourage self-reflection and development rather than giving prescriptive advice? Finally, this research also indicates that peers and students are a trusted source of feedback, and that interactions with peers during the practicum provide spaces for co-construction of efficacy. So another suggestion would be to deliberately create spaces where peer groups are able to meet and share during the practicum, ensuring these peer learning communities become an important aspect of our teacher education programs. To sum up, we need to reconsider how we evaluate our students. We need to create conditions for constructive dialogue and feedback. And we need to increase opportunities for reflective practice and problem solving. Thank you. I'd like to take a moment to thank Dr. Patricia Wood for inviting me to speak to you today.